What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now!
Welcome to Real Democracy Now. I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved. Welcome to Season 2 of Real Democracy Now, a podcast. In Season 2, we'll be looking at representative democracy, its history, how it operates, different approaches to evaluating its operation, the democratic deficit, different types of democracy, as well as the relationship between democracy and capitalism. In Episode 1, I'm speaking with Professor Paul Cartledge about the origins of democracy in ancient Greece. Professor Cartledge was the inaugural A.G. Levants Professor of Greek Culture in the University of Cambridge and President of Clare College, Cambridge. Between 2006 and 2010, he was the Hellenic Parliament Global Distinguished Professor in History and Theory of Democracy at New York University. People refer admiringly to Greek democracy as the genesis of the concept and practice of democracy, and they often lament the distance between that model and our current system of so-called democracy. In your work, you refer to Greek democracies, and in the plural, and identify a range of different approaches. Can you describe for me the key features of these various democracies?
I can, but let me first comment on your first part of your question, which is the so-called as opposed to, as it were, real democracy. The word is the same, but there is a fundamental difference between all ancient democracies and any modern, that is, post-18th century democracy. Namely, theirs were direct, and there were various reasons for that. One of which being, of course, lack of technology, not just scale and size, we'll come back to that, but also simply that their culture was face-to-face and oral. Ours tends to be at a distance, and of course, you and I are talking to each other across the universe, utterly impossible in the ancient world. Secondly, you quite rightly emphasize that I use the word democracies in the plural. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is there was no such thing as ancient Greece, just a one-state, one political system. Ancient Greece was a combination of up to 1,000 different political entities, of which perhaps at any one time, and we're talking now 5th, 4th centuries BC, what I call the classical world, at any time perhaps no more than a quarter maximum would have had a form of democracy. In other words, the majority of ancient Greek cities usually had some form of not democracy, but some form of oligarchy or even monarchy or tyranny, which is, of course, illegitimate monarchy, autocracy. So within the democracies, the most extreme, what Aristotle called the last form of democracy, was that of Athens. And his point was that Athenian citizens, adult, male, free, legitimate, only they could be citizens, had maximum rights and powers. So in other words, not merely did they elect people to office and control the legislation and so on, but any ordinary Athenian person, regardless of wealth, birth, status, good looks or whatever, was equally empowered both to be a legislator and to hold an office. So they had the maximum. Other states said, okay, you can, all of you have a vote on electing, but you can't all stand. You have to have a property qualification. So that would be a modified form of democracy. They might say that you can have a vote on foreign policy, but you can't have a vote on legislation, or vice versa. So there were various ways in which there were restrictions in several of the ancient democracies on total control and total freedom and total power.
So in your book, Democracy a Life, you argue that power is a key component of the original Athenian democracy. Why do you see this as such an important element?
I emphasize power for two reasons. One, because the word demokratia is a combination of two ancient Greek words, demos and kratos. And the demos bit means broadly people, and that means, of course, citizen people. As I said before, adult, male, free, legitimate citizen people. But the other sense of demos is much more controversial, and it's equivalent to, in our English language, the distinction between the people, which we tend to think good, and the masses or the mob, which can have a very negative connotation. So if you are not one of the masses, if you're an elite person, if you're wealthier than the average, if you have a long family pedigree, etc., etc., if you're smart, if you're well educated, you might think of the demos as being something rather negative. It's the masses in the sense of the mob, which you're not a member of. The kratos bit is more straightforward in terms of meaning. In other words, there's no ambiguity. It means strength, force, power, grip. And that's where the power bit comes from. And I'm very interested in what the Athenians thought the power was that was being exercised and over what or over whom it was being exercised. So suppose you're a member of the elite, not a member of the masses. You might think of democracy as actually a system for controlling you, not, that's to say, a system which is being exercised for the good of the people as a whole. So it's a kind of class rule, if you like, a form of sectarian rule. But if you're a Democrat, then you tend to emphasize the other sense of demos, which is the people as a whole. You say that though you are a member of the masses, you are one of the typically the poorer segment of society. Nevertheless, your form of rule, democracy, is power of the people. And here I go into Abraham Lincoln language. Government of the people, for the people, by the people. And that actually is what ancient Athenian democracy was. So that's one reason why I emphasize power. It's in the etymology of the very ancient Greek word. But there's another reason, which is that there are people who think that a watered down, a more sort of light touch interpretation of democracy is more inclusive. Therefore, cross-culturally, one can say that there are other cultures, especially in Africa and in Asia, which at different times have had some form of, and then they use the word democracy in the sense of discussion, or it might be consultation. Actually, there's a king, or actually there's a ruling council, but the people, the ordinary people, are in some sense brought into the process of decision-making, though they don't actually make the decisions themselves. To me, that's a bit illegitimate. I think that's to extend the notion of democracy, to water it down too far. And that's why I emphasize the power, the force, the grip element which the masses of the Athenians, the people as a whole, exercised.
Starting from, I suppose, the Greek democracies, can you sketch out your perspective on the ups and downs of democracy since then?
Yes, now that, as you earlier said to me, might be a rather broad question, but let me take you through, let's say, 3 or 4 essential stages. The nature of democracy as originally conceived is the one that I have so far discussed, that is, the power of the people, in some sense all the people or the poor people, the citizen people. Well, in the later part of the 4th century BC, the High Classical period, this is the period of Alexander the Great. Almost all democracies in any of the ancient Greek senses either simply died out or they were killed out. So in other words, the sort of regime that one sees typically in the Greek world from the end of the 4th century BC onwards, from the time of Alexander the Great onwards, is a form of monarchy. Within the territorial monarchies, you have the pre-existing Greek cities, which some of them cling to the notion of independence. Yes, we're within a kingdom, so in other words, our overlord is a king, but internally we run our own affairs to a great extent, and we don't have a garrison imposed upon us. We're not compelled to pass this law, that law. We can give honours to this citizen, and so on and so on. Well, for that, the Greeks came to use the word demokratia. So in other words, demokratia comes to mean independence or some sort of autonomy, as opposed to having specifically democratic political institutions. It also comes to mean not having a king, not being directly ruled by a king being now the dominant form of political rule of the Greek world as a whole. A Greek city might still say, we have a demokratia here because we don't actually have a king in amongst us ruling us directly. So the word demokratia modulates into meaning republic. The next main phase of Greek history, I'm talking in very broad terms now, is the conquest of the old Greek world, the Hellenistic Greek world as we call it, by the Romans. And the Romans, though they had a funny kind of popular rule, they spoke of the rule of the people, the populace, and it's a res publica, it's a public thing that conquered the Greek world. They actually very much disliked Greek-style primary democracy. They were on the side of Greek oligarchs in thinking that that was really just a form of mob rule, of ochlocracy, something rather sort of disorganized, disorderly, and a bit chaotic. And so they, where they could, and there were one or two pockets of genuine democracy still existing in the Greek world, for example in Rhodes, but as far as they could, they quickly stamped that out. And so for, well, I don't know, getting on for 1,500 years, I suppose, let's say from the time of Augustus, who founded the Roman imperial autocracy, the emperor system, the principate, democracy was just a word. It wasn't a thing. It really didn't exist as a going concern. And it's not until the Renaissance when, in, for example, Italy, certain city-states, as we call them, the notion of il popolo, the people, again pops up. And it is discussed by Machiavelli, for example, who's studying the ancient Romans, and the word populus is there. Well, from that time on, the notion that perhaps ordinary people, as opposed to just a tiny elite, might actually not just have a say, but actually have a quite important say in how the politics of their governments are conducted. That develops. And, of course, the big climactic moment, which I make a big thing of in my book, is in the 17th century in England, and it's sometimes called the English Revolution. An anti-monarchical movement develops, very strong. They're all, those of them who rebel against Charles I, they are quite clear that they no longer wish to have an absolutist, divine right, autocratic monarchy of the kind that Charles thought was his divine right to exercise. So he was executed. They couldn't agree. The levelers were on the left, as it were. They thought quite a lot of ordinary people, even if they weren't rich, should actually have a say, a vote in perhaps their local member of parliament and what have you. Those on the right thought, well, we don't want a king, we want a republic, but it's got to be controlled by the good old people, the landed aristocrats and so on. So there's a big debate going on throughout the 17th century, and indeed it continues into the period of the Industrial Revolution and so on. But how far should the franchise extend? Who should be empowered to have a vote, not actually directly to rule, because that's the ancient way, we're moving into representative government, but have a say in who the representatives should be. And to cut a very long story short, first of all, working class people are empowered as opposed to merely landowners. Then women as well as men are empowered, such that by the end of the 1920s, in most of what we call the Western world, and that includes your world in Australia and New Zealand, have representative parliamentary democracies of one sort or another. We in Britain have a funny mixed constitution where we have a crown, we have a queen, and we call that a constitutional monarchy to distinguish it from an autocratic, divine right, actual, empowered monarchy. But very crudely, that's the major series of movements. And I've not mentioned, but I've assumed, I've presumed, the French Revolution anti-monarchical, the American Revolution anti the British monarchy. These are key stages after the Levellers on the road to universal adult suffrage.
A key feature of ancient democracy, as you've already said, was the direct nature of the exercise of power by the people, the demos, whereas today, I think it's fair to say most forms of democracy are representative. And it's often argued that representative democracy is necessary because of the size of the modern state. How would you respond to this argument?
That was an absolutely correct point to make in the 19th century. And of course, the main theorist of representative democracy, the distinction between a member of parliament being a representative as opposed to being a delegate, is J.S. Mill, John Stuart Mill. Well, in the 19th century, then it would have been very difficult, lacking our extraordinary online communicativeness, to have any other form than representative parliamentary democracy, because simply the transport difficulties, the communication problems, the time it would have taken. The ancient world was typically on a very, very much smaller scale. We're talking about something of the order of maximum 50,000 citizens in Athens, absolute maximum, spread at a distance of no more than 25 to 30 miles from the political centre of Athens. Now, just to look at Little England or Britain, England, Scotland, Wales, the distances involved would have been prohibitive. And the size, therefore, was a sufficient factor, negative factor, against having a regular form of direct people's democracy. Now, what's happened since the World Wide Web and the Internet and online communication and what are called social media, I tend to think they're often anti-social media, is that in principle, we can now do what the ancient Athenians did every 9 days. They went to the assembly and they voted on major issues of principle, not just practice. We could do that. We could say, right, all of you with your devices, whether through the TV or your smartphone or whatever, on a particular day, at particular times, depending on the time zone, etc. Here are the issues. The arguments on one side are these. Here are the arguments on the other. We would like to have, first of all, a straw vote, and then we'll have a decisive vote on whether or not we retain the nuclear deterrent. And or, would you prefer to spend the money that we spend on the Trident nuclear deterrent on the National Health Service? I mean, I'll just give you two extremely contentious examples. Another example might be, would you like to retain the death penalty, or bring the death penalty back for certain offences, or are you content that we do not have the death penalty for any offence or crime, as is currently the case? Issues like that. And the fact of the matter is now, through our media technology, one could. But there is a fundamental, it seems to me, distinction between ancient democracy and modern. They were infinitely better informed. Though their means of news gathering were far more limited, they were not either subject to what we now are told is fake news, or other kinds of ways in which people's attitudes are falsely determined, or people's minds are made up on the basis of what are not facts but are called alternative facts. I mean, we live in the most appalling world, I think, at the moment. But the point is that we're not typically educated. I don't know about Australia, but our school children from a young age are not brought up to think politically, to think of themselves as citizens. Of course, the issues are immensely complex. Of course, society today is infinitely more diverse than it was in any ancient Greek or Roman polity. But nevertheless, we could do a lot better. That's my view.
And have you heard about a global movement called liquid democracy?
That's news to me. I haven't heard of that one, but go on, yeah.
So they're all about using the internet so that people can vote more regularly, but it's not just a straightforward one person, one vote. If you feel that you don't know something about a particular topic, you could delegate your vote to someone else who you feel is more expert in that area. You can delegate it just for particular issues, or you could delegate it for, an entire topic, a body of decision making. You can withdraw that delegation, etc., etc. So they've sort of, they're designing institutional arrangements which they think will take advantage of the internet, but also recognise, I suppose, the complexity of issues and not put people in a position of having to actually make decisions on issues that they don't feel comfortable doing. So,
well, if I could respond on that raises the question of experts. And I don't know how far you followed our Brexit campaign, but one of the lines taken by those who wanted us to leave the EU was that experts, meaning professional politicians, intellectuals and academics like myself, we'd so often got it wrong that ordinary people should simply ignore what we experts claimed to be the case or claimed would be the case and simply act on pretty much on their gut feelings. Well, expertise in, let's say, the matter of nuclear deterrence, or in the matter of should we spend money on this operation or on making that drug available as opposed to this one, and should it be available to all or only those at this stage of an illness? The world is immensely complex. If you are a Democrat, you have simply to hold your nose, I think, and simply say, look, we don't know the answer, we don't know all the facts, but we believe it's better that everybody, in principle, has a say on something. Whether a decisive say or not is another question, but have a say in a forum of communal, and this liquid democracy sounds very interesting, but we shouldn't be too, I think, worried about lack of expertise. Because we then get into the area of, oh, well, so-and-so's IQ is too low. I don't think they should have a vote at all on that issue. So there's a slippery slope that I'm just a little bit concerned about. I'm a kind of radical, egalitarian Democrat in principle.
Can I ask another, just a follow-up question that's come to mind? One thing that I've heard people talk about, and it certainly struck me, in terms of the size of the modern state and, what sort of form of democracy you need for that and so on, is around globalisation, with many global corporations actually larger than some nation states. In a way, politicians, elected representatives, their power is limited as well.
Yes, I completely agree with that. I mean, we live in a very what's the word? Dangerous, I suppose, but challenging is the other way of looking at it positively. Universe, and we are in a globalized world. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. That is where we are. But what one can do, therefore, is beef up, is give more teeth to those already existing institutions which are global. And I'm thinking immediately of the United Nations in relation to war, for example. It's just a question of nations getting to realize that we live in this world, and not what seems to me so disappointing and depressing is this retreat back to almost 19th century nationalism in the face of admittedly major global problems, partly caused by globalism. But I do not think nationalism is a very promising response.
Many democratic theorists seem to accept representative democracy as the only form of democracy available, I guess at the moment, although they take different positions on what might be called between-election democracy, ranging from narrow conceptions where the role of citizens is really just to vote, to broader conceptions where citizens are given multiple opportunities to more directly express their views, maybe even influence decision-making. Do you think these wider conceptions of citizens' roles, and I think perhaps the use of the internet for voting that you were talking about is an example of that, those wider conceptions of citizens' roles between election, do they have the potential to move modern democracies more closely to the ancient model or the ideal?
Yes, I think I was actually going to raise that issue that we needn't think only in binary terms, that it's either the national or even the global level of politics or it's nothing. The local dimension is one that the ancients, Athens being a classic example, were extremely keen on. You became an Athenian citizen not by being enrolled on some national Athenian register, but by being enrolled on your local deme, it's called, that is village, ward or parish register. So in other words, there is a face-to-faceness, a personal understanding amongst the citizens at that level, which is the ground base. It's the absolute fundament of Athenian democracy. Well, now, we have lots and lots of local issues. And, for example, in Cambridge here, we voted overwhelmingly to remain in the EU, partly because I'm an academic at the University of Cambridge. A quarter of my colleagues come from the mainland of Europe. They are from non-UK EU countries. Well, now, it's very important that we have a sense of identity. And one way in which to be fair, national government is picking up on this is introducing the notion of a locally elected, directly elected mayor of Cambridge. We have one famously in London. It took an awful long time to get there. There's going to be one shortly in Manchester and Liverpool, big industrial cities and so on. Cambridge is not a big industrial city, but it is a high-tech Silicon Fen, we're nicknamed. And therefore, it's very interesting to me that direct democracy of a local kind is going to be introduced. Now, the other sorts of things, that's, if you like, a one-off. And so then the mayor would be not responsible to the electorate for quite long periods between each mayoral election. And the other thing, apart from the locality that the Athenians insisted upon, they were very keen on making their elected or chosen by lot officials directly responsible to the electorate on an almost daily basis, so that they didn't get away with forming their own cabals and not thinking about what the masses, what the ordinary citizens needed or wanted. So there are ways in which I think, what should we call them, user groups, groups of people who are chosen, they put themselves forward, they may be chosen by lot, we can come back to this. They form a kind of, we use the term focus group, but this could be more empowered, that they would actually have the ability to gather information, make suggestions towards, in this case, let's say the council of Cambridgeshire or the mayor of Cambridge and so on. So there will be some interplay between elected representatives and ordinary people on a more regular basis between the major incidents of elections.
Have you heard about the G1000 model?
Yes, indeed. That's the sort of thing I had in mind.
Yes. So apparently Cambridge is the only place in England at the moment looking to do that, which is interesting.
Well, it's partly because we can. In other words, we're quite savvy here, technically. And also because, the tradition, Cambridge was Oliver Cromwell's university. We've got a very long anti-monarchical tradition here. Another one I was going to mention is Iceland, where they regularly have referendums which are not binding. Now, we have a referendum once in a blue moon, and it causes utter chaos. And we lose prime ministers, we lose parliamentary representation, and our British politics is in chaos as a result of the last June's referendum. But if you have them regularly, and if you have a panel who are selected on a representative basis from different professions, different walks of life, and they are the ones who make a pre-deliberative judgment on an issue, which comes from the Parliament down to the people, but comes to this group which sort of filters the issues. It's a bit like G1000, except it comes from the top down rather than from the bottom up. That's another model which I think is worth thinking about.
Yeah, I agree. There's a growing number of academics and advocates promoting the selection of parliamentary representatives by sortition, or lottery as you've already referred to it, rather than by election. What is your view on this approach where the parliament is actually selected by lottery?
I'm very keen on the lottery because of its ideological underpinnings. It's premised on the view that in principle anybody can do a particular function, that it gets away from the distorting factors of wealth or notability, notoriety, looks, body language, all sorts of things that can actually distort in an election. A randomized sortition process can overcome. And that's one reason why the ancient Athenians chose almost all their offices, except, interestingly, the very top two executive offices, that is finance and generalship. They appointed almost all their officials. They had about 700 of them on an annual basis by lot. And they also had boards so that you don't have one person in a position to control a particular aspect. It might be waste refuse collection or whatever in the streets. So the principle of the lottery, sortition, I'm entirely in favour of. When you get up to, I've mentioned executive posts, it's slightly risky, the thought that just any old Joe or Joanna might pitch up as Prime Minister. But you've made the point about Parliament. Well, we have an upper house, a lower house. I'm sure you do too. And I think the upper house, or the revising second chamber, is absolutely crucial for probably mainly legislative matters. In other words, picking over the essential aspects of legislation, which possibly representatives in the lower house, the MPs in our case, don't have the time or perhaps the expertise or the interest in particular to inspect before they actually vote to make something a law, to make a bill a law. So I'm all in favour of the second chamber having a very wide range of expertises available to it. And I'm not against the use of the lottery within that process. Now, whether you have, let's say it's a 500-person chamber, half the offices, half of that 500 should be chosen by lot, as opposed to the other half appointed. At the moment, as you know, our House of Lords is totally appointed. It's not elected at all. And there are other legislatures where the upper as well as the lower house is elected. And I'm in favour, I think, of half and half. So half elected and half chosen by lot on the basis of representing different aspects of society, different walks of life, different approaches to life. It's complicated. Everything's complicated. But in principle, I am indeed keen on introducing sortition to some extent in certain areas.
Thank you for joining me in Season 2 of Real Democracy Now, a podcast. In next week's episode, I'll be talking with Nadia Urbanati from Columbia University about her book Representative Democracy, Principles and Genealogy, and Rosalind Fuller from the Waterford Institute of Technology about her book Beasts and Gods, How Democracy Changed Its Meaning and Lost Its Purpose. I hope you'll join me then. Before we finish up today, I'd like to read out 2 reviews that were posted in iTunes. The first is from Lucy in the United Kingdom. A much-needed insight into democracy, especially new and people-centred types. Very informative and clear. Look forward to following this series further. And the second is from Erica in the United States. I'm currently undertaking a PhD in scaling deliberative democracy with digital tools, and this podcast eloquently summarises the key concepts and democratic innovations I'm researching. Reviews not only make me feel appreciated, they also help other people to find the podcast. If you're enjoying this podcast, why not write a review and recommend it to your friends? Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now! You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.